This video is a quick overview of the way in which we adopt the federal budget in the United States. We'll take a look at the process for going through the budget and how the timeline for satisfying a U.S. federal budget is, and then take a look at some of the problems associated with the current process of the federal budget, which works somewhat differently than the way it does in theory. So when we look at the federal budget process, from the easiest way to think about it is it's money in, money out. Right? We have certain revenues that we need to raise. Oftentimes we don't raise enough revenue in order to be able to pay for all the things that we're paying for, so we need to borrow money. And then money goes out into a number of different categories. One is mandatory spending, and those are things like Social Security and Medicare and various other means-tested programs that people are eligible for under the law. And these basically are on autopilot because people are eligible for certain benefits. Second is interest on the debt. We have a sizable debt of about $23 trillion in the United States. Every year that needs to be serviced, meaning we pay the interest on that, and that's a quite sizable portion of our budget as well. And then finally, the one thing that actually Congress and the president pretty much have the ability to be able to deal with is what we call discretionary spending. And this accounts for about a third of the federal budget, about half going to defense and the other half going to programs like education, agriculture, transportation, things like that. So that's the overview, the quick overview of the federal budget process. Now, when we think about this, there are a number of steps that occur in order to be able to get the budget. The federal budget runs from October 1st until September 30th, which is a rather odd time. And your numbered year is the upcoming year. So say, for example, the budget is adopted for September 1st through October 1st through September 30th, and it's enacted in 2019, it will be for the budget year of 2020, fiscal year 1920. So what happens here? Well, in the beginning, about a year and a half out from the actual budget starting, the various executive agencies and the executive branch start to come together and put some numbers together for what they would like to fund and what sort of programs that they would like. They submit these then to the Office of Management Budget through the White House, and the White House makes its own priorities and comes up with a budget. And the president usually does that around about the time that he does his State of the Union address in February. At that point in time, Congress is also taking a look at the president's budget. It is under no obligation whatsoever to even heed any of that budget, obviously, except for those things that are mandatory spending. Since 1974, in order to be able to have a more rationalized process, both the House and the Senate have to pass what's called a budget resolution, which should be done around mid-April. And basically, this is an overall spending blueprint for the coming year. And that helps various the various committees work on how much they think they're going to be spending. At that point, prior to September 30th of each year, there is no kind of one single budget bill. There are actually 12 different appropriations that go out for various issues such as education, transportation, defense, and other things like that. So there's 12 separate budget bills that are passed individually by Congress. And then both chambers look at them. If they don't reconcile and add up together, then they have to have a conference committee, and then they pass the budget and send it on to the president. And the president can veto that or sign it into law, veto the individual appropriations or sign it into law. Right? So that's kind of the textbook definition of the way the federal budget process works. What we've seen in recent years is that, for the most part, we've had a very difficult time passing the budget on time, meaning by September 30th. And what happens at that point is members of Congress have to come together and pass what's called a continuing resolution. Because if we get to October 1st and there's no actual budget, at that point in time, the government has to shut down. So the continuing resolution is to say that we're going to operate at the current spending levels for, say, the next 2 weeks or the next month or whatever until we get a budget passed. We've been operating like that for quite some time in our difficulties of having different budgets. So let's take a look at a pretty good overview of what this budget process looks like when we're not necessarily looking directly at the idea of the textbook definition of the budget. So this is from a national association that studies the budget for us.
Welcome to Road to the Federal Budget from the National Association of County and City Health Officials. Local health departments like yours are funded annually through state and federal dollars. For those that aren't quite sure how those federal dollars trickle down to your local health department, we are hoping to provide a little insight into the sometimes overly complicated process. So first things first, what is the federal budget? The federal budget is the amount of money the federal government will spend each year. The budget includes items such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and agriculture. So what is the process of the federal budget? The federal budget is first created and proposed by the President with his team of policy experts in the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. The federal budget as proposed by the President in FY 2017 is around $4.1 trillion. With the exception of a new administration, the President then sends their budget requests to Congress each February for the coming fiscal year, which begins in October. So in February 2016, President Obama submitted his budget requests for FY 2017. So step one, where do the requests in the budget come from? The President and cabinet members decide policy priorities for each federal agency. Those priorities are given to the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which then give instructions to each federal agency on how to construct their budget. So, for example, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, submits its own budget request to OMB and defends the request with data or documents supporting this request. The OMB then uses these documents to prepare the President's budget request. In step two, after the President's budget request has been released to the public, it's Congress's turn to pass their own budget resolutions. The Congress can entirely ignore the President's budget or write their own. They set their own spending, taxation, and policy priorities called a budget resolution in the House Committee on the Budget and the Senate Committee on the Budget. The budget resolution is not a legally binding resolution, but is more like a blueprint for overall spending by the federal government. The House writes theirs first, followed by the Senate. The two each pass their resolutions and then come together in a joint conference to iron out the differences. A reconciled version is then voted on in both chambers. However, Congress doesn't require a budget resolution to fund the federal government. Step three, once Congress has voted on their budget for the year, the Appropriations Committee in the House and Senate then set the level of budget authority for all discretionary spending programs. Budget authority refers to the legal power of a federal agency to spend money by entering into obligations. The Appropriations Committee's top-line spending level is then broken down into the 12 Appropriations Subcommittees. The 12 subcommittees are Agriculture, Rural Development, and the Food and Drug Administration, Commerce, Justice and Science, Defense, Energy and Water, Financial Services and General Government, Homeland Security, Interior and Environment, Labor, Health and Human Services and Education, the Legislative Branch, Military Construction and Veterans Affairs, State and Foreign Operations, and Transportation and Housing and Urban Development. Most public health programs are funded through the Department of Health and Human Services. Information is gathered and hearings are conducted by each subcommittee in examining each agency's proposed budget. Each member of Congress can write a letter outlining their spending priorities for each of the bills. Once the priorities of members are known, the subcommittee chair then writes the first draft of the subcommittee's appropriations bill. The first draft is called the chair's mark and fits into the constraints of the House and Senate budget resolution. Once it has passed subcommittee, it goes to full committee where it is reviewed and submitted to the full House or Senate for consideration. The fourth step in the budget process is the vote on appropriations bills and reconciling the differences between the two in the House and Senate. The House and Senate subcommittees each have their own bills, their own justifications for spending levels of different agencies and programs. The House and Senate pass their own versions, and then conference committees resolve the differences between the two. Once the reconciled version is produced, it is voted on by both chambers. Once a conferenced appropriations bill is passed in both chambers, it moves on to the president for signature. In step 5, the president signs each appropriations bill and it becomes law. When the president has signed all 12 appropriations bills, the budget process is complete for the fiscal year. However, this rarely happens by October 1st, the start of the new fiscal year. When the budget process is not complete by October 1st, the Congress must pass a continuing resolution to keep agencies funded for a set period of time. These levels are based off the previous year's budget. The Congress and the President do not always agree on the appropriations bills, and the President has the power to veto any bill, which then goes back to the Congress. The federal agencies are funded by the continuing resolution until a bill becomes law. Sounds easy, right? Well, in the current political climate, it can get messy when lawmakers decide or divert their budget priorities for political gain. Political ideology can play a key role in the budget process. We hope this Budget 101 training has been helpful in your understanding of the budget process. To learn more about NACCHO's annual funding priorities, go to naccho.org.
So one of the things that they did not discuss there in stage number 6 was that the president does have the ability to be able to veto each one of these appropriations bills that comes through. But one power that the president does not have that most governors have is what's called the line-item veto, which means that the president could individually go in there and cut out individual projects that were, for whatever reason, were deemed to be wasteful or not good ideas. So, for example, let's just say that there's a program there to redevelop Kapelski, and that seemed like a good idea to somebody that was a representative from our area, but the president didn't think it was a good idea. If he had the power to have the line-item veto, he could come in and strike that out directly. There was an opportunity back in 1996 when Congress passed and President Clinton signed a line-item veto act for the president. However, President Clinton used that a couple of times, and members of the United States Senate took the case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that there was nothing inherently wrong with the line-item veto, but that Congress could not voluntarily give this up through legislation. Rather, the only way we could get the line-item veto for the president, particularly on issues of appropriations, was to have a new constitutional amendment. So as it is, the president does have the ability to be able to reject or veto, obviously with the potential of an override, any one of these 12 appropriations bills, but can't actually single out individual items in them. That's a basic overview of the federal budget process.